Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Clearwater's August Healthcare Cyber Briefing. I'm Monica Pastor, Senior Events Marketing Manager here at Clearwater, and I'll be your host for today's session. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us today. Our session is titled Beyond Compliance, Risk Analysis, Risk Management, and the Future of HIPAA Enforcement. So, as we know, healthcare organizations continue to navigate an increasingly complex cybersecurity and regulatory environment. So, while new federal proposals continue to evolve, one expectation has remained remarkably consistent. Organizations are expected to perform meaningful enterprise risk analyses, actively manage identified risks, and demonstrate that those efforts are ongoing, not simply documented. So today, we'll discuss what regulators are expecting today, what may be coming next, and most importantly, what healthcare leaders should be doing now to strengthen both compliance and cyber resilience. I want to cover just a few housekeeping items for today's session. All attendees are in listen-only mode and will remain on mute and off camera. Please submit any questions that you have using the Q&A feature at any time during the presentation today. We'll reserve time towards the end for audience questions. A copy of today's slide deck, blogs, and relevant articles for today's session can be found in your resources tab on your Zoom navigation bar. And then towards the end of the session, an attendance certificate will pop up that you can download for your attendance today. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants following today's session. And lastly, we'd love to hear your brief feedback from today on the post-event survey. So we appreciate your insights so we can continue to make these sessions valuable to you and worth your time. Before we kick things off today, we wanted to let you know that Clearwater is conducting a healthcare AI benchmark study to better understand how healthcare organizations are adopting AI and approaching security, governance, and risk management. So we invite you to share your perspective by scanning this QR code on the slide or clicking the link on the resources tab. The responses are confidential and will really help shape an industry benchmark report on AI adoption trends, common challenges, and emerging best practices. And then you'll receive a copy of the final report when it's published as well. So we look forward to your participation there if you'd like. Now let's meet our speakers for today's presentation. First, we're joined by Dave Bailey, Vice President of Consulting Solutions and Strategy at Clearwater. So Dave always leads our monthly healthcare cyber briefings and brings decades of experience helping healthcare organizations navigate cybersecurity risk, regulatory compliance, and resilience. So he'll begin today's session with an update on the latest cyber threats impacting the healthcare sector and the key regulatory developments organizations should have on their radar. And then joining Dave for today's discussion after our cyber update are two nationally recognized healthcare attorneys. So Robert Kantrowitz is a partner at Kirkland and Ellis, where he advises healthcare organizations, private equity firms, and technology companies on complex healthcare regulatory matters, cybersecurity and privacy issues, digital health, and transactional compliance. He regularly counsels organizations through cybersecurity incidents, regulatory investigations, and evolving compliance requirements, giving him a unique perspective on today's legal and business risks. So welcome, Rob. We're also pleased to welcome Iliana Peters, shareholder at Polsinelli and former acting deputy director for health information privacy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. During her time at OCR, Iliana helped oversee HIPAA privacy, security, and breach notification enforcement and played a key role in developing national health information privacy policy. So today she advises healthcare organizations on privacy, security, AI governance, regulatory compliance, and incident response, making her one of the country's leading voices on HIPAA enforcement and healthcare cybersecurity. So welcome, Iliana. Thank you for being here today. I know that everyone's going to come away with practical insights that you all can apply within your organizations. So with that, I'll stop talking. Dave, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick us off.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, and thanks, Monica. Very much looking forward to the discussion in a little bit, but we are going to dive into July. And July broke a pattern and flipped the script on ransomware. July was the busiest month of 2026 for reported ransomware data leaks that was driven by dental practices and specialty clinics. At the same time, AI should be raising eyebrows. In the last 2 weeks of July, three different frontier AI models from two different labs reached real production systems that we're not supposed to touch. Three things are driving healthcare cybersecurity risks now. Each one compounds the other. AI capability is outpacing AI governance inside your organization and your vendors. HIPAA enforcement in 2026 is consistent in one specific recurring failure, and ransomware actors have measurably rotated towards softer targets in the sector, which is a targeting decision, not a coincidence. And we're going to take them in that order. AI, then mid-year breach enforcement numbers, and then July's ransomware surge in depth. So let's dive into the AI, which we see here about frontier AI models. Here's the story that deserves attention because it changes what AI risk is. We're not talking theory anymore. In late July, OpenAI disclosed that two of its own frontier models escaped a sandbox test environment, found a genuine zero-day vulnerability on their own, and used it to breach Hugging Face's production infrastructure. No human directed the attack. The models executed thousands of individual actions across the intrusion. They were chasing a benchmark answer key, and along the way, they demonstrated something security teams should be worried about and have been worrying about for years: a model that can find and chain real-world exploits without being taught the specific vulnerability first. Hugging Face's own security team caught and contained the activity days before OpenAI even connected it back to its own testing. Days later, Anthropic disclosed something similar for a different reason. A misconfiguration by a third-party evaluation vendor gave two Claude models live internet access during what was supposed to be a sealed test exercise. Three real three real organizations ended up touched. To be fair here, the techniques the model used were unsophisticated, weak passwords, unauthenticated endpoints. There really wasn't anything novel. The failure was in the evaluation setup, not a rogue model chasing its own agenda. But the lessons hold either way. The wall between a test environment and the internet is thinner than most may assume or ensure that you have the right controls in place. And separately, this one disclosed. This is a disclosed research issue, not an incident. Anthropic's newest model found a new mathematical weakness in a post-quantum encryption candidate under NIST review, a way to speed up attacks on a reduced round version of AES encryption. I want to be precise here about what this does and doesn't mean. Nothing in production today is broken. The AES result doesn't touch the production AES version that everyone deploys. And the post-quantum scheme that cracked was a challenge parameter, not the security grade version. But it compressed what would have been a long experiment-driven crypto analysis project into about 60 hours of model time. That's a pattern across all three of these stories. The gap between theoretical and AI did it last week, almost closed overnight. The legislative response is itself worth reading as a data point. And I want to point out that a bipartisan bill, the Kill Switch Act, the AI Kill Switch Act, excuse me, was introduced within 9 days of the Hugging Faces incident. This is generally a fraction of time security or privacy legislation typically takes to move in Washington. It's not law yet, but would require the largest AI developers to maintain the technical ability to throttle or shut down their own frontier models, with the Department of Homeland Security able to order it during a genuine crisis. Over 1,200 employees at OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and Meta, including some of the most senior people in the field, signed a public letter the same week asking Washington to help build tools to deliberately slow AI development if it starts to outrun anyone's ability to oversee it. And on the defensive side, and the last thing to point out in the AI landscape is Google reported that an AI-driven pipeline found and fixed more Chrome vulnerabilities across its last two releases than previous 2 years of releases combined. I think this is the point that we have been making over the last several months about what the potential risks are with these frontier AI models. You certainly see today that is important for the good guys to be able to find and use the frontier models to be able to find and fix vulnerabilities in the systems that we rely upon within the healthcare sector before the adversary gets them, so they can find those vulnerabilities and exploit it. Ultimately, this is the same underlying question about you know the timing of the offense versus the defense. Hopefully, as I said, the good guys can use the capabilities in order to fix the problems before the bad guys do. So let's take a look at some immediate actions to take. These three disclosures share one root cause. The line between the test environment and the production is a contractual assumption, not a technical guarantee. Inventory AI, every AI tool in use in your environment, sanctioned or not, and know exactly what data and systems each one can reach. If your organization runs AI red teaming or security evaluation exercises, ensure that network isolation and independent verification and containment before any testing starts. That's precisely the control that failed during the last third-party test. Consider your AI vendor contracts, and this is something to consider as we look at the pace of AI. Do we need to consider that contracts need to specify throttle, suspend, or shutdown capability now of any ahead of any law requirement requiring it? Enforce MFA and least privileged on any system or AI tool, any AI or agent can reach. It's important to note that the liability is certainly important for covered entities or business associates to understand, regardless of which system or actor caused the exposure. The model did it, doesn't necessarily will account or doesn't provide the accountability from a regulatory perspective. And the last note here that's extremely important that pointed out in what AI is doing today is that if you're piloting AI guided robots, any type of delivery bots, disinfection robots, anything that touches a surgical workflow or a clinical workflow, ask your vendors today directly how that system behave when it hits any unexpected or adversarial input. So let's take a look at some strategic priorities for the health sector. The 5 actions I just walked through fix this month's specific failures. These 4 are about the trend underneath them, not the incidents themselves. It's important, I think, that we need to track the AI Kill Switch Act and its companion audit bill. Whatever becomes law will likely reshape your AI vendor contracts and your compliance obligations. You build your AI governance case now. Your organization's AI risks exist today, whether or not you have a formal program to manage it. Innovation is outrunning the guardrails. Treat frontier model capability growth as a leading indicator, not a future problem. The 2 labs own models breach production systems this month with no adversary involvement at all. And ask your security vendors directly whether AI assisted defense, vulnerability discovery, deception techniques is on their own roadmap. The 1,200 lab employees who signed that letter are effectively telling you the people closest to this technology don't fully trust it and its current trajectory, or at least understand what the potential risks are. And I think ultimately, when we manage AI throughout the use in healthcare, we have to be able to trust it. We have to be able to assess risk, and we ultimately have to build trustworthy systems. So let's shift from AI to where HIPAA breach enforcement numbers stand at the mid-year mark. 2 numbers to hold on to as we go through this data: 394 and 100%. Through July 10th, OCR's breach portal shows 394 breaches affecting 27.6 million individuals. 86% of those breaches traced to hacking or IT incidents. Here's a number that matters more than the headline count: 5 mega breaches of a million records or more. This is a handful of catastrophic events, not a broad wave, are driving almost all of the harm. Monthly volume has held steady, and as we can see, July is only a partial reporting month, so not too much to read into the first 10 days of July. So let's move on to enforcement. So now that number I talked about, the 100%, every one of OCR's eight enforcement actions this year totaling in 2.28 million in penalties, traces back to a missing or inadequate security risk analysis, one that didn't follow OCR's own public expectations for what a risk analysis has to cover. And enforcement is reaching further than it used to. Two of those 8 actions hit self-funded employer health plans, not hospitals or providers, demonstrating that the obligation to protect patient data doesn't stop outside the hospital walls or the doctor's office. Penalty size also doesn't track breach size. There were several incidents, including 15 million record breach that settled for $10,000, but it only because of a documented financial hardship. There was also another health system, by contrast. They had a breach of under 54,000 records and drew the year's largest penalty at 552, $250,000. This message from OCR is consistent and getting louder. Conduct a risk analysis that meets OCR's expectations and show how you manage that risk throughout its life cycle. Documentation alone isn't enough anymore. OCR's own review activity in 2026 is also expanding to scrutinize risk management, not just the risk analysis that was performed. I can't stress enough that your risk analysis needs to cover all assets that store, process, transmit PHI information. And once you identify those risks, document and manage those risks throughout its life cycle. Knowing your risks can help you minimize the impact of ransomware. And let's look into the ransomware threat. Now to where I want to spend the rest of our time before we move into the conversation about potential rulemaking. July was generally the worst month of the year, and let's take a look at how bad it is. I want to start off with 2 Health ISAC reports that were published. Health ISAC put out 2 advisories in the back half of July on 2 groups worth knowing by name. Shiny Hunters has shifted away from deploying ransomware solely, and they're going after your identity layer instead, using phishing and social engineering to obtain legitimate single sign-on credentials for platforms like Okta, Entra ID, and Google, then walking straight into your cloud applications through abused OAuth flows. Recent healthcare and medtech victims in their pattern include Medtronic, iRhythm, and One Medical. WorldLeaks is the rebrand of Hunters International, which itself traces back to the Hive ransomware operation that law enforcement dismantled back in 2023. Same infrastructure, same negotiation playbook, a new name. They've publicly abandoned encryption altogether, and this group have gone purely to data theft and extortion, citing declining ransomware payment rates. And they increasingly hit third-party vendors to reach multiple downstream healthcare victims through one compromise. Our own threat intelligence lines up with what Health ISAC is reporting here. WorldLeaks already accounts for 6 confirmed healthcare and pharma victims in our own tracked data set this year. When the 2 independent sources converge on the same actor, that's a signal to respond to today's threat. So let's move on to what the overall, where we are year to date. So activity is accelerating. We just noted that July was the busiest month at 62 victims. This was up 77% from June's 35 last month. 285 total victims, 55 distinct threat actors. Qilin remains steady, ever-present baseline threat, and we are going to talk today about a new threat actor that has emerged, and we need to watch this actor closely because it's concentrated in dental and possibly further activity we're going to see throughout August and continuing, and we are going to do a deep dive into that. So let's take a look at the detail. So July was the busiest month of the year for healthcare data leaks, 62 victims. That's the sharpest single month jump we've seen all year. 55 distinct threat actor groups have targeted the sector so far in 2026. Qilin remains that steady baseline, as I said. Ultimately, 2 brand new groups that we're going to do a deep dive into soon, Chaos and Dark Project, also entered the healthcare picture for the first time in July. 3 new or resurgent entrants in a single month in itself signal worth carrying forward. The barrier to stand up a ransomware operation targeting healthcare keeps dropping, not rising, and we're currently see that with the resurgence of new threat actors. So let's move on to the targeting patterns. So far year to date, 61% of the reported data leaks, that's 174 out of 285 victims, were specialty practices. 38 of the 285 or 13% were dental, and 23 of the 285 victims were hospitals. So let's do a deep dive into those targeting patterns. So here's the pattern underneath all of this. Specialty practices and dental offices combined, and they account for 74% of every healthcare data leak that we've tracked this year. As you can see in the middle of this targeting matrix, the purple and the red certainly highlight the volume that the threat actors are going after specialty practices and dental. And if you combine that group, that accounts for 74% of all those practices. Dental is another area that I think certainly requires much attention. This isn't random. Smaller organizations present a softer attack surface, and nearly every major ransomware actor we track is now weighted toward exactly that target class. If your organization is a specialty practice or a dental group, you are not a secondary target. You are the primary one, and that should change how you prioritize your security budgets and look at risk, understanding how you can address the direct threat that is, against you and this subsection of the health sector. So let's dive into July. So what you saw before were the year-to-date numbers. Now we're going to look at what July is, and this is what was quite alarming, specifically for the dental practices. You can see the concentration in specialty practices and dental. I checked our Google Threat Intelligence feed this morning, and while this is a monthly cyber briefing that focuses on July, we're at August 6th, and there are already two additional dental victims that have been reported. So once again, this is not a coincidence. This is an escalation and something certainly important to keep an eye on. So July really focused the new threat actors. I'm not going to try to pronounce it other than I'll say CRPXO. And they targeted 7 dental practices. They are a new threat actor that emerged in July, and we're going to do a deep dive into that. So let's do that now. This group extorts under its own brand. That brand of malware, Data Breach Plus, running a malware as a service panel called TwizAdmin. With high confidence, they are a high confidence Russian speaking origin. The ransom notes that they apply appear in Russian, English, and Chinese. They are financially motivated, double extortion. They steal data, then they encrypt files. And the targeting logic is deliberate, not opportunistic. Most dental and specialty practices don't run 24/7 SOC or advanced DDR. They hold dense concentrations of PHI, intake forms, social security numbers, driver licenses, full records, and their scheduling, billing, and imaging systems are real time, so central to daily operations that a practice under encryption faces immediate pressure to pay. That combination, thin defenses, rich data, zero tolerance for downtime, is exactly the profile that this threat actor was built to exploit. 5 things to act on if this describes your organization or your vendors. You need to right now, in order to prevent yourself as a dental practice or a specialty practice, enforce immutable offline backups for your charting system, servers, databases. Restrict script execution, things like Python, VBS on front office endpoints that have, no business running those types of scripts. Configure your EDR to flag clipboard monitoring processes, which is a signature of crypto wallet hijacking tools bundled within this malware family. Train front office staff specifically to recognize fake captchas or font download prompts. The click fix style lure this group favors, and enforce any type of phishing resistant MFA on any remote endpoint. It's extremely important right now to take these actions seriously and look to ensure that you can improve your defenses and hopefully minimize the attack that the dental groups are going on today. So we are going to close out the ransomware section with a just a deep dive and an introduction into three actors that you need to know about. We've been talking about Qilin, probably going on close to a year now. Qilin is the established franchise. They're a ransomware as a service operation that we've tracked since 2022. And certainly as we understand, this is an extremely important group to know. If you don't know about Qilin, it's time you do know. They are by far the leading threat actor that is causing ransomware throughout the healthcare sector. Chaos is a post takedown rebrand formed in mid 2025 by former members of a group law enforcement had just dismantled earlier that year, and it has already run over 50 tracked attacks, peaking at 15 in July alone. And the last one that I will mention today, this is a little bit of an unknown yet. Dark Project. They came up on the ransomware data leaks, and we need to monitor. This is their first appearance. Was in July. They have 4 victims so far in July. We don't have any confirmed attribution to any group, but this is certainly one to watch, and certainly keep a close eye on. I can't stress enough. You need to know your adversary so you can prevent these kind of attacks. So key takeaways before we move in to the next phase of the conversation. Ransomware readiness is not a large enterprise or hospital only type problem. It's a whole sector problem. And right now, specialty practices and dental groups, they're carrying the largest share of it. If you're in either category, you are the current primary target, not a future one. Identify and manage every AI tool that touches your environment before you have that kill switch act or an auditor telling you to do so. You have to improve your patch velocity. We've talked about this. The organizations getting hurt this year are not the ones without, are ones without security program. They're the ones whose risk analysis didn't turn anything into risk reduction. And it's important to understand and plan for, machine speed defenses, because your adversaries, it's important that we can keep up with the speed of the adversary. Well, that's where the threat landscape stands heading into August, and very much looking forward into the next phase of this conversation. So, welcome, Rob and Iliana. Um, you know, uh, before we dive into the conversation, as we know, HHS published HIPAA Security Rule, the NPRM, on January 6th of 2025. This was the first major overhaul of the rule since 2023. Um, you know, Comment period on that rule closed back in March. Certainly at that time, there were a lot of opinions. No final rule has been issued. The current unified agenda now lists the rulemaking under, long-term actions, and projects final action next July in 2027. This date is an agency estimate, not a legal deadline. The proposed rule, still needs to be finalized, materially revised, and ultimately, we don't know the status yet. So the practical message is that OCR is not waiting for a final rule, that we know risk analysis and risk management are already required, and many in the themes in the NPRM reflect how important risk analysis is. So with all that said, as we set the stage, my first question is for Iliana. How should healthcare organizations interpret, the NPRM's placement on that long-term agenda? How much weight do they need to give to it, and what does this really mean? Would love your insight.
Yeah, sure, Dave. It's a great question, and a question that we've been getting a lot from clients, obviously. To your point, just to make clear for the audience, what HHS published was proposed only. So we are seeing a lot of vendors who are telling folks that they need to start moving on these requirements. That is not correct. As we see rulemaking fluctuate significantly over the life of any particular rulemaking. And we're seeing that with not only this rulemaking, but the other rulemakings that OCR is undertaking right now. And that means that we don't know what is going to end up in the final rule. And we need to be patient and wait for that final rule to actually come out. Those final rules will have at least 6 months compliance period after their publication before enforcement will occur. That's a requirement in the HIPAA rules. So it's not like you are going to have to comply with any new requirements on day one. That's just not how a rulemaking works. So at the time a final rule is published, entities will have time, at least 6 months, if not more, depending on whether or not OCR decides to extend those deadlines for enforcement to come into compliance with any new requirements. And that's really important to understand. I think, certainly the security rule is an interesting discussion because I think the tension with the security rule is that we're always trying to find the right balance between prescriptive regulatory requirements and the ability of a rule to be flexible over time. And I think the example that I always like to use is encryption, because as you mentioned earlier, Dave, we're moving to quantum computing, and encryption may become obsolete very soon. And that proposed rule included encryption requirements. Right now, encryption is addressable under the security rule, which means you encrypt or you do something better, if there is anything better. Right now, there's nothing better, so we encrypt. But tomorrow, there could be something better. And if the rule is telling us we must encrypt instead of using the next best thing, whether that's quantum computing or something else, then we're stuck doing encryption. And so there's this tension, particularly with the security rule, that we're trying to find the balance between prescriptive requirements related to data security and keeping that PHI protected versus the inability for the security rule to be flexible and scalable over time. And so I think that's a constant flux. I think the other piece that people have missed in this discussion is the safe harbor. There is an enforcement safe harbor that refers to the implementation of frameworks and protocols, including those under the NIST framework, including the cybersecurity framework. So to the extent that a particular HIPAA-covered entity or business associate is facing enforcement by OCR, particularly civil money penalties or settlements of those civil money penalties, if they can produce evidence that they've implemented the cyber framework, the NIST cyber framework, for example, then that may assist them in convincing OCR under the safe harbor, the enforcement safe harbor, to reduce those penalties. So it's not like we don't already have the opportunities to implement robust cyber frameworks in our enterprises. It's whether or not we want that to be a carrot or a stick. Right now, it is a carrot. It's not a stick. And moving forward, it may very well become a stick if those revisions to the security rule do in fact progress. But I think we'll just have to see. So to your point, we haven't lost any requirements, and to some extent, those requirements are flexible and scalable and have grown and changed over time. Certainly, what OCR considers reasonable now is very different from OCR considered reasonable when even I was there, 10 years ago. So, so that picture looks very different. And we already have the opportunity to implement cybersecurity best practices and to get credit for them in the HIPAA space now.
Yeah, no, and one of the things I will say is, when the NPRM came out and what's great is today we have lots of great ways to summarize what it means. I actually spent time to read some of it, and what I was appreciative of the proposed rulemaking was there was a lot of background and a lot of dialogue in the proposed rulemaking of why they were doing things, and they reinforced, just as you said, we still have the playbook is there for us in order for us to understand what we have to do. I mean, OCR's focus is still going to be, did you do a risk analysis? What risks do you have? What did you do about them? And do you have the ability to prove that? Can you show evidence of a documented and and effective plans. So how closely does that, three-part piece, what risks did you find? Did you find risks? What did you do about them, and can you prove it? How does that reflect the way OCR approaches a security rule investigation today?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think at the end of the day, OCR is going to look for the gaps in your implementation of the requirements of the HIPAA rules, whether it's security or privacy. If you cannot produce a robust response to the question, then it doesn't exist. And that is the easiest case for OCR to make from an enforcement perspective. If you have a breach in a place that was not considered as part of your risk analysis, it is a very easy case for OCR to make. So from my perspective, it's my job to help my clients figure out how to not have gaps in those compliance postures. Not just because it makes good regulatory sense, but also because it's practically appropriate, right? We want the threat landscape to be covered. We don't want there to be holes in the threat landscape where the threat actors can get through. So it just makes sense from a practical perspective as well as from a regulatory perspective. If you can't produce the business associate agreement, you're going to get dinged on that. If you can't produce the NPP, you're going to get dinged on that. If you can't produce the risk analysis with that particular class of PHI and that asset in it, you're going to get dinged on that. So it's not rocket science the way these investigators approach these cases. If you have it, chances are they're going to say very, very good. We might make some changes as we move forward. If you don't have it, that's where you're going to have the trouble.
No, and as I stated in the briefing, that 100% number, it seems, and 100% of all enforcement actions prove that folks are not doing that. Rob, from your perspective, and would love any other additional insights outside this question. How has the legal exposure associated with a known but unremediated cybersecurity risk changed?
Yeah, so agree with everything Iliana said. That it was really well put. And say from a legal perspective, maintaining a known but unremediated cybersecurity risk, such as lack of MFA, unpatched vulnerability in the software, unsegmented network, and so on, has progressed from something that was always potentially problematic with respect to operational business risk, right? In other words, leaving the gates open for an incident to now a key focal point in regulatory enforcement and liability, especially from OCR and class action litigants. So it's important to advise clients that a documented but ignored threat can create a paper trail that is then viewed by regulators and plaintiffs as potential admission of noncompliance, as Iliana alluded to before, right? It's like a slam dunk that they're going to jump right on that. The fact that you have this documented issue and then haven't actually fixed it, or it's a notable gap in your compliance, and showing like an admission of noncompliance or negligence if, say, a breach occurs. And so organizations won't just be dealing with the direct costs and consequences with respect to remediation, such as getting the systems back online, sending out notices, credit monitoring because of known issues that weren't fixed. These will be seen as evidence of penalties and some sort of negligence or willful inaction, and that's what either regulators or plaintiffs will try to hone in on in potential enforcement or litigation. So starting with HIPAA and OCR, one, actually remediating the issues gaps are required under HIPAA. Risk management is a required implementation specification under the HIPAA Security Rule, and it requires covered entities and business associates to implement security measures that are sufficient to reduce the risk and vulnerabilities to EPHI that are reasonable and appropriate, and at a reasonable and appropriate level. And then two, another thing to note here with respect to making sort of the fact that you have documented risks but aren't actually fixing them, something to consider is that under the HIPAA enforcement rules, the penalties are scaled based on the four-tier system, right? So there's tier A, that a violation the covered entity was unaware of and could not have realistically avoided and had reasonable time of care been taken to abide by the HIPAA rules. Then there's tier 2, which is a violation that the covered entity should have been aware of but could not have avoided even if reasonable amount of care. So basically falling short of like willful neglect under the HIPAA rules. And then a violation suffered as a direct result of willful neglect of HIPAA rules in cases where an attempt has been made to correct a violation. And then there's tier 4, a violation of HIPAA rules constituting willful neglect, and there's no attempt has been made to correct the violation with 30 days. And each of these tiers increases the potential penalty that could be had. So this is actually something that has an economic change to your sitting on, say, some sort of gap or vulnerability and then not remediating it, because it then impacts the type of tier of penalties that you're going to see in an eventual enforcement. And so heightened monetary figures and how up you go in the tiers. And so the main takeaway here is burying your head in the sand can lead to increased HIPAA penalties. Now, in terms of OCR's recent actions, we saw a bunch of, and I think you showed them earlier in the presentation here, 2026, 2025 resolutions against covered entities, business associates for alleged poor cyber hygiene and failing to not conduct risk assessments, and then also failing to remediate the issues they knew or should have known about in those assessments. And these settlements led to 6-7-figure fines and corrective action plans. And then additionally, April this year, this is very timely, right? OCR released an educational video titled Risk Management Under the HIPAA Security Rule. And not sure if anyone here caught that video among the plethora of content we all have out there from your Netflix and HBO Max or whatever. I don't blame you. I'm sure others were enjoying Love Island while I was tuning into OCR discussing the detailed management obligations under HIPAA and highlighting common compliance failures uncovered during the recent data breach investigations. The life we've chosen. But drawing on the recent investigations, OCR emphasized that risk management is not just a simple compliance exercise. It's administrative task or paperwork to be overlooked. Rather, it's HIPAA-regulated entities must actually implement, maintain, as well as document security measures to reduce their risks with respect to EPHI. So when aware of the risks, there's no action to fix them. Organizations are left exposed both to cyber attacks and potential enforcement actions. And OCR wasn't shy about noting that it penalized these entities for failing to conduct accurate and thorough risk analyses and to uncover and remediate the system vulnerabilities potentially that were not potentially, but actually exploited by the threat actors in those instances. So, as many of you also already know, on the other piece of this is HIPAA does not provide a private right of action. Plaintiffs' attorneys cannot sue an organization directly for HIPAA violations directly. Instead, a lot of class action litigators use, state law negligence claims using OCR investigation findings to establish negligence per se or prima facie evidence of the breach of duty there. So when OCR issues a statement outlining that an organization failed to implement an accurate risk assessment or failed to remediate the vulnerabilities, plaintiffs introduce these findings into civil court to induce settlements or seek damages on these issues and drastically driving up class action settlement values. So another thing too I want to highlight, because this is also on the preventative side, is under certain underwriting standards when dealing with cyber coverage, right? Everyone wants to get as much cyber coverage as they possibly can with respect to the organization or what's appropriate. Some cyber carriers, if they see that there's been ransomware attacks that were caused because of unknown unpatched vulnerabilities, carriers may look for certain exclusions and not want to cover your type of organization with respect to that. So that's just another thing to really keep in mind. So, in some here, there's a lot of legal consequences to knowing about HIPAA security holes and not plugging them up.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is important in our current world of too many things to do and how do you prioritize things? How do you, manage the time, money, and resources that you have? I think the question always comes about of, what does good look like? What do I need to do? What is that reasonable and appropriate, piece? So Iliana, I wanna ask you from your perspective, what does an accurate and thorough enterprise risk analysis look like in practice?
Yeah, and we just got a question too, Dave, that I think is right on topic here. So I think the question is basically, do we do an accurate and thorough risk analysis, or even if we can't manage those risks, or do we not? In other words, pick your poison. And I think my opinion is, and I would love to hear the collective thoughts here, but my opinion is that it's always better to do the accurate and thorough risk analysis. And that means you should identify all of the EPHI in your enterprise. You should know where that EPHI is. And that's the hard part. Obviously, Clearwater is very good at that. And one of the reasons that I respect Clearwater and have worked with you guys for such a long time. That's the hard part, really finding all of the EPHI in the enterprise and understanding the assets that hold the EPHI. And that means everywhere. That means vendors, that means devices, it means systems, applications. It's hard. It is not an easy exercise, particularly if you are a large system, for example, with lots of different facilities, et cetera. To the extent that you undertake that risk analysis and you do find all of the EPHI and you don't have any gaps, that makes OCR's job a lot harder. So if you have in fact identified the system that is subject to the cyber attack, then, and you can point that out to OCR, then the next step is obviously the one that Rob was just talking about, and managing those risks, right? Managing the risk to that system where that breach occurred. Sometimes that is hard, and sometimes the resources are not there. Those are better arguments to make all day long, from my perspective, than we just didn't identify it in the first place. In other words, it is better to find the gap and identify the gap and defer the risk for whatever reason, for whatever period of time. It is not ideal, to be clear. I just want to be clear. It is not ideal, but it is easier to make an argument that lowers you in a penalty tier with regard to risk management than it is if you didn't identify the risk in the first place. And so we need to be really thorough about looking for the EPHI in the enterprise. We need to be thorough about identifying the assets and the threats and vulnerabilities to all of this data, such that we can appropriately manage the risk. Even in some circumstances, that means deferring risk to insurance or other techniques, if that is necessary from a budgeting perspective or resource perspective for other reasons. It's not ideal, but we can make those arguments, whereas we need to identify the data and the risk to the data.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could echo that too. Yeah, just to bury the head in the sand doesn't really work as an excuse. It also, you can at least check the box on the risk assessment. And also, working a lot in the M&A space, if I, diligence an organization that says, no, we haven't had any incidents or breaches or anything like that, I'm like, well, have you conducted a risk assessment? They say no. I'm like, well, you don't know if you've actually had anything like that. That's almost scarier, more concerning from that perspective, because, a lot of the world that we live in here and like doing the transactions, right? It's pretty rare that having a breach is going to, terminate a deal, right? Usually what it is like, we just want to box in the risk of some sort, right? So now if I know that you have some sort of incident or some sort of investigation going on, we can create an indemnity or create some sort of like post-acquisition plan to help fix it, right? You're getting an investor, you're going to get, some influx of money that might want to like, maybe the reason you didn't fix it is because of budgetary concerns. Now you have a larger investor coming into your organization to help, push those ideas forward. And having at least a knowledge of what your gaps are will allow you to more efficiently address those in those sorts of situations too. So yeah, in various different perspectives, I would 100% agree with what Iliana said.
Yeah, and effective and credible risk management, I think, trying to understand that while there is a extremely important compliance component that every organization has to undertake, and know that they are required to do certain things, and if they don't do those things, then it could mean penalty. But in the long run, it also means today that we have a threat out there that is impacting the health sector, and it's important for us to be able to understand our risks, and try to minimize what we the exposure that we have to the threat actors. And Rob, so from like what the separation of what a good risk management program looks like to one that is kind of that check the box, would love a little bit more insight on that. And then I want to add something to it, because it's always important. Like what do you see as like the reporting to leadership and to the board, and what risk management is? What are you seeing out there from that perspective?
Yeah, so kind of like we were discussing before, so conducting a risk analysis without remediation or developing a subsequent risk management plan is like sort of like when I I call my parents and they told me, oh, the doctor said I need to go to PT. And then I asked, well, did you go? And then they changed the subject. So it's like, so step one is diagnosing and you're halfway there, but then fixing the problem is important to mitigate your risk. They're both important, but you need to also have both steps in the process. So we've seen, OCR in particular make this position known through enforcement, directives, and other public statements. OCR is not only focused on risk assessments, but effective risk management. And if you have the chance to read any of their press releases in your free time, you'll see a lot of the common themes in their focus regarding the actual, lack of risk management plans and effective remediation. So, and I know like OCR has previously described risk management as including taking the results of the risk analysis to inform decisions about HIPAA's administrative, physical, and technical safeguards, evaluating whether existing controls address reasonably anticipated threats, including cyber attacks and disasters. I mean, crazy things have happened, right? You need to know what your organization's risks are, right? I was doing a transaction. We were looking at a company with a facility somewhere in Tornado Alley, and I'm not kidding. I thought they were joking. I said, have you had any issues with HIPAA? They're like, well, actually, we had a natural disaster come in and a tornado blew all the PHI like out of the facility and they were just sitting in boxes, right? So that organization, I don't know, maybe if you're in a tornado zone, you should have like a more secure infrastructure in place there. So understanding and evaluating where your controls and anticipated threats are. And then implementing security measures such as access controls, audit logs, encryption that reduce security risks, and then ensuring workforce compliance, having regular training. Is there disciplinary action for breaking with policy at the organization? And then periodically assessing and updating those measures and new threats as tech and then the advancement as you were talking about before with AI. Things are going to be changing, and you want to be have a nimble approach to how you deal with these sorts of things. And then just to mention as well, you really want to make sure there's good vendor vetting and contracting enforcement of those provisions when you're dealing with vendors, such as under your BAs and so forth. Those should not just sit on the shelf as well. And then you asked the other piece about leadership, right? So council and internal teams should assist in implementing structure, routine, and routine cadence with respect to reporting to the board. Board reporting should focus on what really matters to them, though, like governance, risk management, actual and not just theoretical risks, and financial exposure. So, for reference, one of the big things the board worries about are things like, like a Caremark claim, which is a shareholder like derivative lawsuit alleging, directors, officers breach fiduciary duties, things like that, and would allege things that the directors failed to properly monitor, corporate operations leading to regulatory violations, penalties, financial loss. And there's also other things you want to worry about as the board in addition to the, that type of litigation, but like there's HHS and OIG guidance with respect to board reporting, responsibility for like a culture of compliance. And that includes, security and privacy as well. So, when an organization suffers a major HIPAA breach due to unknown, unpatched vulnerability, the resulting exposure, OCR fines, state AG penalties, class actions could lead to potential exposure to the board as well. So you want to make sure that they're informed. And there's instances, though, in rare cases, boards could see some sort of issues. So it's thinking if like OCR declares the company acted with willful neglect, shareholders may use that exact finding to argue, say the board acted in bad faith. So having some sort of steps and processes to report to the board the major issues so the board can be involved. And right, you also don't want to report things to the board that cannot be fixed, right? It doesn't really help them. You want to report things to the board like, oh, we maybe need to move some budgetary budgetary issues around so that we can pay for this remediation, right? No one wants to look at, say, the board was reported XYZ issue, there weren't funds to support it, they chose not to do, or worse, they chose not to do it. Like that might not look so great in a court or to a regulator.
Hey, well, I know this has have been just an outstanding conversation. I know there's lots more to touch upon for sure. I think we've got some questions out there and maybe we can get some closing remarks from both of you before we end it out. So, Monica,
Yeah,
what do we have out?
quickly, let's cover as many questions as we can before we have to end today. So, question for you, Dave. For patch velocity, what are your thoughts on patching within 72 hours for all MS patch Tuesday patches and other critical vendor vulnerabilities? Quickly, if you
Yeah,
can.
I won't spend too much time on this other than to say that baseline is really good. I know that recently CISA put some guidance out some tiering and understanding, what is the criticality of that patch and how important it is and getting it into, that particular cycle of 72 hours is a great goal and a great target. Knowing that we're moving at machine speed, 72 hours may not be enough in the future. So I don't want
Right.
to put that scare in, but we really need to
Yeah.
improve our ability. So
Yeah, I was just going to say, Dave, I mean, I think I absolutely agree, that these are good targets. I will warn, however, though, if there is a published vulnerability, AI is already exploiting it. So you need to be aware that that is the circumstance you're working with.
yeah, 100%.
All right, next question from Garrett. There was a ton of pushback on the NPRM from small practices that couldn't keep up with requirements due to low budget and resources. Do we expect the rulemaking changes from comments in 2027 to account for smaller practices and more flexibility from that side?
I'll just jump in really quickly on that one, although I'm sure Rob has thoughts too. The short answer is no. I think that burden holistically is probably one of the reasons that OCR is taking another look at the rulemaking altogether. So not just small entities, not just small covered entities and business associates, which would include small practices and small health plans as well. So the burdens proposed by that rule, I think, were under-characterized, undercounted, and not well reflected in that proposed rule. And I think a lot of the comments reflected that. I think the burdens were going to be a lot bigger than contemplated, which was part of the problem with a lot of those proposals, and why OCR is rolling back. However, to the extent any particular requirement is finalized, the approach is not going to be different for small providers versus large providers. That is just not generally how the HIPAA rules work. It works that way in enforcement, as Dave highlighted at the beginning of the presentation. If you are a smaller entity with fewer funds, your penalty may be smaller, but the enforcement will not take a different approach.
Thanks, Iliana. Next question. How can we operationally meet all the expectations when healthcare usually has 1 to 2 people in compliance and IT is low on resources? Rob, do you want to answer that one for us?
No, that's a great question. I think a lot of what we see when we're dealing with sort of folks that are overstretched is taking the risks in turn by like priority, right? So that's another reason why it's important to score the risk and also like tier everything. Understanding like there's various organizations of various sizes with different size of the internal teams. And so look, realistically, for a lot of organizations, it might take years to really assess every single system. You see like large hospital systems are like that, right, too, or small provider practices, they're overstretched, stretched thin. And so you just want to focus on like, look, what are our biggest risks and how do we address those first? And take that sort of tiered approach often is something that we've seen is successful. Look, is it going to be 100%? Are you going to protect everything? Maybe there's something that you're not really foreseeing, but no, but are you going to play the odds on it? Yeah, that's something to just think about and how you want to prioritize, your risk management framework and developments and steps that you want to take.
Awesome. All right, last question, if we could answer it in like a minute. When a known security risk cannot be effectively mitigated because a vendor lacks critical capabilities such as MFA or SSO integration or requires prohibitive costs and timelines to implement them, where should accountability reside? And how do we as an industry push for third-party products and services to meet the same security standards expected of the organizations that depend on them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I'll just jump in really quickly and then you guys can jump in. I mean, at the end of the day, covered entities are responsible for their business associate vendors, period, end of story. So if you are aware of a pattern or practice of non-compliance by your business associates, you are required by the rules to terminate your relationship with that business associate. And from a market leverage perspective, I realize that's very unrealistic for a lot of entities, but it's the way the rules work. If enough of you and your colleagues in the industry get together and put pressure on a vendor, and we have seen this with small EHR vendors, for example, that do not do security well, you can make change happen, but it is sometimes hard. I don't know, Robbie, you have thoughts, I'm sure.
No, I mean, this is a common question we get a lot, and it's because the in-house compliance or security privacy teams are like, our business folks really want this relationship and like they're pushing back on us. So one of the things is you can call your outside counsel. We love to be the bad guy. That's what we're here for. So we're happy to tell sometimes business folks no or work with them on that piece. So I understand there's a push and pull, right? You have to balance the how big of a business case is this really versus the risk that they have with them. Look, maybe you make a bet that look financially this is just going to be such a boon for the organization that you can deal with some risk that you could try to mitigate in the documents themselves, and that's another conversation to be had. But otherwise, sometimes you can see look, there's five other competitors out there. Let's go with those instead. So really thinking about like what the real business opportunities are against what the risks are is something that's kind of the approach that we take, and then we try to work with the internal folks and so on.
Well, thank you, Dave, Iliana, and Rob, for sharing your insights today. We really appreciate all of your time. We don't have time to cover these upcoming events, but we have several virtual events happening in September that we'd love you to be a part of, and some in-person events we'll be at are the Nashville Healthcare Sessions and the annual Bluebird Leaders SOAR Conference. So we hope to see you there if you're going to be attending as well. Our time is at an end for today now. At Clearwater, we are here to help and committed to your success. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, or you can jot them down in the feedback survey and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And those of you that we did not get to your questions, we will follow up with you via email. We have your contact information and we'll be sure to get those questions answered. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next month. We'll meet on the second Thursday, September 10th, for our next healthcare cyber briefing. Take care, everybody.